It's October 1769. A wooden sailing ship sits off the coastline of what Europeans are just beginning to call New Zealand. On shore, Māori warriors stand watching, suspicious, armed and ready. The ship is British, the crew is British, and the captain is British, but the voice calling out across the water isn't. It's coming from a man standing at the rail, a Polynesian man, a man who has never been to this part of the ocean before, and yet the words he's speaking, the greetings, the questions, the warnings, are close enough to the Māori language that the warriors on the shore can understand him. What follows isn't a fairy tale of instant peace. What follows is days of desperate, painful, sometimes fatal misunderstanding, in which that voice at the rail is the only thing standing between two worlds that have never met, trying to stop them from tearing each other apart. Who was that man? Why was he on a British ship thousands of kilometers from home? And why is his name not well known? Hi there and welcome to Hoodie History. I'm Michael, I'm an Australian history enthusiast, and I love exploring all kinds of fascinating history from all over the world. Subscribe to follow me here for more fascinating explorations into the past. I publish new episodes regularly, and I also post a lot of short videos on my social accounts like Instagram and TikTok. History usually remembers the people who planted the flags and wrote the journals, but today we're looking at a man whose voice was arguably the most essential tool on Captain Cook's Endeavour. A high priest and master navigator who drew an astonishingly accurate map of the Pacific and who opened doors that no British sailor could have opened alone. His name was Tupaia. He was a man of formidable intelligence, extraordinary skill, and remarkable courage, who has spent 2.5 centuries living in a footnote that he never deserved. And I think that's worth fixing. A note before we get started, this is a story that touches on Indigenous Polynesian history and a figure of real significance to Māori, Raiva Vivian, and broader Pacific Island communities. I've tried to tell it honestly, including the uncomfortable parts and including the ways in which the historical record is limited by the fact that it was almost entirely written by Europeans. Where Pacific Island scholarship and oral traditions offer a different perspective, I've tried to reflect that, and where the evidence is genuinely contested, I've said so rather than picking a version and presenting it as settled fact. And I've tried to get the pronunciations right throughout the story, but I'm sorry in advance if I get them a little bit wrong. Okay, let's get back to the Pacific. This is the story of Tupaia. To understand who Tupaia was, you first need to understand something about the Pacific world that he came from, because that world is almost incomprehensibly different from the one most Western history education describes. The Pacific Ocean covers roughly 165 million square kilometers, about 46 million square miles. It's the largest and deepest ocean on Earth. It takes up more of the planet's surface than all of the world's land masses combined. And yet, by the time Europeans began seriously exploring it in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was already home to millions of people who had been traveling, trading, settling, and maintaining complex cultural networks across its vast distances for more than 3,000 years. This wasn't accidental, and it wasn't random drift. Polynesian and wider Pacific Island peoples developed what we now recognize as one of the most sophisticated systems of maritime navigation in human history. They read the stars, yes, but they also read ocean swells, wind patterns, cloud formations, the behavior of birds, subtle changes in watercolor and temperature, and the way currents felt against the hull of a vessel. They carried this knowledge in their minds, passed down across generations through oral tradition, ceremony, and direct apprenticeship. It was a complete, empirical, and extraordinarily effective system for moving through one of the most demanding environments on the planet. And Tupaia was trained in this tradition at the highest possible level. He was born on the island of Aotearoa, in what are now called the Society Islands in the Central Pacific. Aotearoa sits roughly 220 kilometers, or about 135 miles, northwest of Tahiti. It was, in Polynesian cosmology, a place of profound significance, home to Taputa Puatea Mare, one of the most sacred ceremonial sites in the entire Pacific world, a place of ritual, political power, and the formal transmission of knowledge. Tupaia rose to become an Ariowai, a member of a sacred society of priests and performers who held exceptional social status and moved freely between islands. More specifically, he became a high priest and what we might loosely call a chief navigator of Raiatea, carrying deep knowledge not just of how to move across the ocean, but of the political, social, and spiritual landscape of the Pacific world. And then, sometime around the 1750s and 1760s, the historical record isn't entirely precise in the chronology, Raiatea was invaded and partially conquered by warriors from the nearby island of Bora Bora. Tupaia and other high-ranking Raiateans were displaced. He eventually made his way to Tahiti, where he became a close associate and, according to some accounts, the personal advisor of Purea, a high-ranking and politically formidable woman who was a significant figure in Tahitian society at the time. By the time the ship HMS Endeavour arrived at Tahiti in April 1769, Tupaia's political situation had become complicated. The alliances he had depended on were shifting. Purea's own influence had diminished following conflict with rival factions, and Tupaia, this man of extraordinary knowledge and capability, found himself in a position that, from a purely pragmatic standpoint, offered limited prospects. Enter James Cook. Cook had been sent to Tahiti on a scientific mission to observe the transit of Venus, an astronomical event that would help calculate the distance between the Earth and the Sun. The scientific work was completed by early June 1769. Cook then opened his secret orders, which directed him to sail south and west in search of a hypothetical southern continent, what geographers of the era called Terra Australis Incognita. Cook and his botanist Joseph Banks had both spent considerable time interacting with Tupaia during their months in Tahiti. Banks in particular was struck by Tupaia's knowledge and abilities. He wrote in his journal that Tupaia could name and locate more than 130 islands across the Pacific from memory, islands spread across an area roughly the size of Europe. Banks pushed for Tupaia to join the voyage. Cook agreed, though with notable pragmatism, his journals record that he saw Tupaia as potentially useful as an interpreter and cultural intermediary, rather than as someone whose knowledge deserved engagement on its own terms. This distinction matters because it tells you something about how the encounter was understood from each side. For Tupaia, the decision to board the Endeavour was more complex. He wasn't joining a European adventure story. He was, by his own framework, making a calculated political and personal decision, maybe seeking new alliances, maybe driven by genuine curiosity, or maybe responding to displacement from Raiatea. He brought his own goals, his own intentions, and his own understanding of what the voyage meant. Those intentions were not recorded in his own words. What survives is almost entirely filtered through European accounts. That limitation's real, and it's worth calling out clearly. What we can say with confidence is this: when Tupaia stood on the deck of the Endeavour as it sailed southwest from Tahiti in July 1769, he wasn't a passenger and he wasn't a curiosity. He was a man of formidable knowledge and capability, sailing into waters that he, in many respects, understood better than anyone else on board. One of the most remarkable things Tupaia produced during the voyage, and arguably one of the most remarkable documents in all of Pacific history, is what scholars now call Tupaia's map. And I want to be a bit careful here because this map has been the subject of academic debate, and I'd rather give you the honest complexity than a tidy story that oversimplifies it. The document in question is a chart that was produced during the voyage. Historians broadly attribute it to Tupaia, though Cook and other crew members may have been involved in its physical execution, working with Tupaia's knowledge to produce something that Europeans could read. The chart shows islands spread across a vast swathe of the Pacific. The names are Polynesian. The spatial relationships between islands reflect Tupaia's navigational knowledge. Early Western interpretations of the map treated it as puzzling or even confused, because when laid over a modern geographic grid, the positions of the islands don't match perfectly. But scholars including Anne Salmond, David Turnbull, Lars Eckstein, and Anja Schwartz have argued that this approach fundamentally misreads what the map is doing. It's not a Western cartographic document attempting to represent absolute geographic coordinates. It's a navigational document rooted in a Polynesian spatial framework. One that represents the relative relationships between islands as experienced by a navigator moving between them, accounting for wind, current, and voyaging practice. When analysts have attempted to read the map on its own terms, including reorienting it and adjusting for the navigational logic that's embedded in it, it begins to reveal something pretty astonishing. The islands it shows span an area of the Pacific over 5,000 kilometers, or about 3,000 miles, across. That's a geographic knowledge base of breathtaking scope, held in one person's memory and understanding. Think about that for a moment. In 1769, the most advanced European cartographers were still arguing about the basic shape of the Pacific, while Tupaia had a working mental model of it spanning distances that Europeans couldn't have physically surveyed in a lifetime of trying. In October 1769, the Endeavour reached the coastline of Aotearoa, what Cook was calling New Zealand, and this is where Tupaia's role on the voyage became something that no amount of advanced planning could have predicted. The first encounters at Turanganuiakiwa, or what Cook named Poverty Bay, were not peaceful. They were tragic. Profound cultural misunderstandings in those opening days led to violence, and Cook's men shot and killed several Māori, including a leader named Te Maro. It was a catastrophic beginning, and it makes what happened next all the more significant. Because Tupaia was there, he was calling out across the water, speaking words that Māori could understand, trying in real time to bridge a gap that the Europeans around him had no tools to bridge. Māori are Polynesian. Their ancestors migrated to Aotearoa from eastern Polynesia. The best current evidence suggests from the Society Islands region, the same part of the Pacific that Tupaia came from, in the late 13th century, around 1280 to 1300 CE. 700 years is a long time. Languages change, cultures diverge, but the linguistic and cultural connections were still close enough that when Tupaia spoke, Māori could follow him, and he could follow them. This wasn't a minor logistical convenience. At almost every other point in Cook's voyages where he encountered new peoples, communication was a matter of gestures, guesswork, and mutual bewilderment. But here, because of Tupaia, there was something approaching actual conversation. In the days and weeks that followed, at places like Talaga Bay, Tupaia's ability to speak, negotiate, and establish something resembling trust became the single most important factor in preventing further bloodshed. Māori accounts preserved in oral tradition and later recorded by New Zealand historians indicate that Māori recognized Tupaia's status as well as his language. They understood what an Arioi priest was. They could place him within a framework of prestige and spiritual authority that made him, in important respects, easier to engage than the European sailors around him. In fact, Māori reverence for Tupaia was so absolute that for generations after the voyage, local oral traditions didn't remember the Endeavour as Captain Cook's ship. They remembered it as Tupaia's ship. To the Māori who met them, Tupaia was the great chief and high priest navigating the vessel. Cook and his heavily armed British crew were, in that telling, simply Tupaia's entourage. I love that detail. I think it's one of the most quietly powerful reversals in the entire story. Tupaia also drew images of these interactions, a series of sketches attributed to him, though their precise authorship has been discussed by scholars. They show Māori and Tupaia engaged in exchange. As the Endeavour continued its journey through New Zealand up the eastern coast of what Cook was beginning to map as New Holland, through the Torres Strait, and eventually toward Batavia, Tupaia's role as interpreter and cultural bridge continued. At multiple points along the voyage, indigenous peoples encountered by the crew responded to Tupaia with a recognition they didn't extend to the Europeans. In some of the islands visited between New Zealand and New Holland, people identified linguistic and cultural connections to Tupaia's world. His status as a high priest, his knowledge of sacred genealogies, of navigational traditions, of the deep cultural frameworks of the Pacific, gave him a kind of currency that couldn't be replicated by any European on the ship, regardless of their rank or authority. His relationship with the crew was also, by various accounts, a complicated one. He was respected, but not always comfortable. The ship's surgeon, William Monkhouse, appears to have had a reasonable relationship with him. Banks clearly found him fascinating, and Cook respected his usefulness. But Tupaia was also in a position of dependency on a ship commanded by men who held power over his physical circumstances in ways he couldn't fully control. The colonial aspect of the encounter, whatever the quality of individual relationships within it, was always present. Tupaia wasn't a passenger on his own terms. He was on a European ship within a European chain of command, sailing toward European objectives. And that tension isn't something I want to smooth over. It's a central part of the story. In October 1770, the Endeavour arrived at Batavia, the Dutch colonial city on the island of Java, now the Indonesian capital, Jakarta. The ship needed repairs after running aground on the Great Barrier Reef several months earlier, and Batavia had the facilities to provide them. Batavia in 1770 was one of the most important trading ports in Asia. It was also, at that time, extraordinarily unhealthy. The city was built on low, swampy ground and crisscrossed by canals that had become badly contaminated. Malaria was endemic. Dysentery moved through the population regularly. For a crew that had spent months in a relatively clean environment of the open Pacific, the exposure to all of this was catastrophic, and Batavia broke them. As disease swept through the crew, Ta'iata fell ill. He was the young Tahitian boy who had travelled with Tupaia throughout the voyage. He was his companion and acolyte. Ta'iata contracted illness in Batavia. As the boy lay dying, Tupaia, who had survived the displacement of his people and the treacherous politics of Tahiti and thousands of kilometers of uncharted ocean, he was shattered by grief. Ta'iata died in late 1770, and Tupaia, completely broken, succumbed to illness just days later. He died mourning a child, thousands of kilometers from the islands he had mapped for men who would survive to claim the glory. Cook recorded Tupaia's death with notable brevity. Banks was more openly affected. His journal entries from this period carry a genuine sense of loss that the more reserved Cook's did not. Tupaia might have been in his 40s at the time of his death. The exact year of his birth is unknown, and he never saw Raiatea again. For roughly 200 years after his death, Tupaia's role in the voyage was treated as a footnote. Interesting maybe, but fundamentally secondary to the story of Cook, of Banks, of the Endeavour, and of European exploration. The map was held in various European archives, puzzled over, occasionally referenced, and largely misread, because it was being assessed against the wrong framework. The sketches attributed to him were catalogued as curiosities. His name appeared in Cook's and Banks' journals, but the journals themselves framed everything through the lens of the voyage as a European endeavour, which meant that Tupaia's perspective, his motivations, and his own understanding of what was happening largely disappeared from the official record. The reassessment of Tupaia's involvement has been gathering momentum since the late 20th century, driven significantly by Pacific Island scholars, Māori historians, and researchers in post-colonial studies. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, in particular, Tupaia has undergone something of a remarkable reclamation. His role in early contact between Māori and Europeans has been reassessed from the Māori side of the encounter, drawing on oral histories and traditions that had always retained a memory of the Polynesian man who came with Cook and could speak their language. He is, in that tradition, a significant figure in his own right, not a supporting character in someone else's story. And the work of historians like Anne Salmond, whose book The Trial of the Cannibal Dog gave Tupaia sustained and serious treatment, and the ongoing scholarly engagement with his map have fundamentally shifted how he's understood in academic circles. His map is now widely recognized as an extraordinary document of Polynesian geographic knowledge, even as debate continues about precisely how to interpret its spatial logic. In 2010, a major exhibition in New Zealand, Tupaia, the remarkable story of Captain Cook's Polynesian Navigator, brought his story to wide public attention. His reputation in the Pacific, particularly in Aotearoa, where he's remembered as a figure of profound significance, has never needed the rehabilitation that Western historiography has required. What his story reveals, when you look at it carefully, is the sheer scale of what Pacific peoples knew about their ocean, and how much of that knowledge was either dismissed, misappropriated, or simply not registered by the Europeans who encountered it. The Pacific wasn't an empty space awaiting discovery. It was a network of relationships, knowledge systems, and cultures of extraordinary sophistication. Tupaia's map is maybe the single most vivid surviving illustration of that fact. It now sits in archives in the United Kingdom, drawn from the knowledge of a man who died in a Dutch colonial port before he could go home. The thing that stays with me about Tupaia's story is the question of what he wanted. We know what Cook wanted, we know what Banks wanted, we know pretty well what the British Crown wanted. Those intentions are documented in detail because the people who held them wrote things down, and the institutions they served preserved those documents. And the historiographic tradition that followed treated those documents as the primary record of what the voyage meant. Tupaia's intentions, his reasons for getting on that ship, his sense of what the voyage represented to him, his feelings about the encounters he mediated, and his experience of the months at sea and the months in Batavia, exist primarily as fragments, refracted through other people's perceptions of him. And that's not unique to Tupaia, it's the condition of most people in history. The records we have are overwhelmingly the records of people with the power to make records. Everyone else, the majority of humanity across the majority of history, survives in the archive only as they appear to those people, as useful or troublesome or curious or forgettable. What I take from Tupaia's story is a kind of obligation, an obligation to read the silences as carefully as the words, to ask not just what happened, but whose account we're relying on when we say so, and to explore the possibility that the most interesting person in any given historical encounter might not be the one who wrote the journal. Tupaia drew a map of an ocean that stretched across a third of the planet. He called across the water to people whose language he recognized. He carried in his mind a world that Europeans could barely imagine, and the Māori who met him remembered it as his ship. He deserves to be known by his name. So that's the story of Tupaia, the Polynesian navigator who guided Captain Cook and who deserves far more than a footnote in the history of that famous voyage. I really enjoyed researching this one and learning about Tupaia. It's the kind of story that keeps giving. The more you encounter it, the more extraordinary it gets. I hope you felt some of that as you were listening. If you want to keep up with Hoodie History between episodes, come and find me on Instagram or TikTok. You can find me at Hoodie History on both. I publish short history videos over there regularly. And if you want more history delivered straight to your inbox, stories, reflections, the occasional deep dive rabbit hole, the Hoodie History newsletter is the place for it. You'll find the sign-up link in the episode description. The stories and opinions on Hoodie History are based on my own research and represent my own views. History is always a living conversation, so if you've got something to add or something to challenge, the comments are open. Thanks for spending this time with me. Building something like this takes real hours, and knowing that there are people on the other end of it makes every one of those hours worth it. In the next episode, we're going somewhere completely different, and I promise it'll be an equally enthralling adventure. Until then, take care, stay curious, and I'll see you next time.